Hello, good night. Welcome to Legalize this 22nd day of February 2026. Tonight, we continue the discussion on the issue of violence. Gender-based violence is the topic for tonight. And one second, please. Good. Yeah, sorry about it. I have a young assistant with me, and I just had to please. All right. Yes, so tonight we have with us Dr. Halimah DeShong, who is the director of the Institute of Gender Development Studies at the University of the West Indies. She served as an ambassador and second deputy permanent representative at the permanent mission of St. Vincent and the Grenadines to United Nations for SVG's term on the UN Security Council. She is an award-winning researcher who has published extensively on sexual and gendered violence in the Caribbean, including in Grenada, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, and Barbados. She's the author of SVG's National Gender-Based Violence Action Plan, and has created curriculum and other teaching tools at the university's secondary and post-secondary levels to address sexual and gender violence. And I am advised by people who know that we can have no better person than Dr. DeShong to assist us to drill down on this problem that has been prevalent, that she has spent many years studying and has provided advice and opinions and policy suggestions to address this issue. But before I invite Dr. DeShong to enter into the discussion, I just want to first of all apologize for the absence of my co-host. She's having some internet issues, but hopefully she will join the discussion as soon as she is able to do so. And I also want to recognize those who sponsor this program and assist us to come on week after week, namely Gel Professional Solutions, Inc., Gem FM carrying this program on FM radio out of Canada, and also Grenada Technical and Allied Workers Union, GTAW. Good night, Dr. DeShong.
Good night, good evening. Thank you so much for the invitation to be here. And let me say good evening to Grenadians listening in Grenada and in the diaspora as well.
Yes, the background to this program, I believe you know, just in the last 2 weeks, we have had 2 tragic incidents where young female adults, in fact, I think they were both teenagers, and one was 21 and one was 18, were killed in circumstances which were quite tragic and circumstances which people who study these issues say are, if not addressed, they are likely to reoccur. In fact, those who study these issues have said to us that there are many precedents, and in fact, they suggest that maybe we have not been focusing on the real issues so as to address this problem. As mentioned earlier in our discussion before we came on, the generally people, when these things happen, the emphasis is on punishment, and one can understand because I mean these are really tragic and impact heavily on any community. So one can understand that kind of reaction. But there are others who say that we need to go beyond the emotions, beyond the anger, because if we don't, we will have to go back in that same place, maybe in the not too distant future, which something we all hope doesn't happen. So, welcome once again, and it's over to you.
Thank you very much, Joseph Ewart, for inviting me again. I really do not like meeting under these circumstances. And even though I've done work on sexual and gender-based violence for very many years, the whole point of that work is I wish one day I could get up and not have to do this kind of work, because it would have meant that the conditions under which women, girls, persons whose gender identity and sexuality might be deemed to be not normative would not experience violence. And they are among the groups who are most likely to be affected by sexual and gender-based violence. I also wanted to start by extending my condolences and good wishes and prayers to the family and communities affected by the recent deaths of Tereshel Sebastian and Alejandra Hippolyte. And this hearing, just reading the media and listening to the media reports about the alleged circumstances under which their deaths occurred, continues to be heartbreaking. And what is really sad is that they are reflective of patterns of violence against women that ends up in the death of women, not just in Grenada, but across the wider Caribbean. I'm currently in Jamaica, and we have seen a spate of violence against women in Jamaica, an escalation in the killing of women and of children, an escalation in sexual violence against women here. In St. Vincent and the Grenadines, we unfortunately again opened the year with the killing of women and ended the year in the same way. And we move across the CARICOM region, the OECS region, and the levels of violence against women and girls continues with an unabated frequency and intensity. So it's really important for us to think about, even as a tremendous amount of work has been done, a large part of that work by women civil society organizations across the region, by the commitments we've made to ourselves as countries. We are signatory to a range of treaties that promote gender equality and the ending of violence, gender justice, the ending of violence against women and girls. There's a sense in which we have not done enough, right? And I think we really need to take a pause and really have that critical reflection on what has and has not worked in preventing the death of women and girls in the region, because we are facing no one should die in these circumstances, and we must do what is necessary to change the trajectory that we currently face. And so I kind of wanted to start there, just with an urgency for us to really take stock of what is unfolding and what has been unfolding for far too long, what has been a part of the history of the Caribbean and continues with an intensity and frequency in contemporary Caribbean society. So I just kind of wanted to make those framing remarks, and for us to also take some personal accountability for how we reflect when these deaths occur. Some of the things I'm reading online, some of the things that people have been sharing with me that are being said, that even after women are killed, we still engage in a level of victim blaming and excusing and rationalizing what should never be rational forms of violence against anyone. So I'm happy to speak in very much more specific ways about what we do in terms of communities, in terms of education, in terms of our legislation, in terms of state responsibility, about taking accountability, and about how we might want to rethink our systems, practices, and ideas that produce these forms of violence against women and girls in particular.
Yeah. So, if I may ask, clearly gender-based violence is a universal issue. Am I correct in saying that? Okay.
You're correct in. Go ahead.
Based on the data, are we worse off in the Caribbean than the rest of the world?
And unfortunately, I'm sorry to have to say, based on the data, yes, in a global sense. So the global, for example, take intimate partner violence as a subset of gender-based violence, and I'm happy to say a little bit more about what we mean when we talk about gender-based violence, sexual and gender-based violence. Intimate partner violence, that is violence that happens in the context of intimate relationships, whether those persons are cohabiting, in visiting relationships, and so on. The frequency with which it occurs in the Caribbean, there is actually statistics on Grenada, because Grenada is one of 5 Caribbean CARICOM member states for which there exists prevalence data. In studies that were done between 2018 and 2019. I was part of the qualitative component of that and actually prepared the qualitative component of the report for Grenada, so I could speak a little bit more about that. The world average is 1 in 3 women will experience some form of intimate partner violence in her lifetime. In Grenada, that figure is higher than 1 in 3. It is so 1 in 3 amounts to about 33.3%, and in Grenada, that figure is 39%. In Guyana, that figure is 55%. In Jamaica, that figure is also 39%, and in Trinidad and Tobago, that figure is 48%. And I think Suriname is also, Trinidad is about 41, 42%, and in Suriname, that figure is about 48%. So all those 5 countries for which there exists prevalence data have higher than global average of lifetime prevalence of intimate partner violence against women. And when you look at these statistics, for example, what this actually looks like in Grenada. In Grenada, the lifetime prevalence of, when you combine physical violence against women in intimate relationships or sexual violence that they may experience in an intimate relationship, that amounts about 30%. And among Grenadians who suffer lifetime physical violence from an intimate partner, more than 2/3 of those women, more than 2/3 of that violence is severe violence, right? Close to 1 in every 10 Grenadian women has experienced sexual violence in her intimate relationship over her lifetime. And sexual violence includes being raped by a partner or sexually assaulted in some other way, including being intimidated into having sex or forced or to engage in some form of sexual violence. So those are not happy figures by any means to talk about. And then when we think about the age cohort, different age cohort, there's a prevalence of current physical violence for those in the age cohort between 20 and 39 age, they are almost 2 times as likely than older women to experience intimate partner violence, including sexual violence in an intimate relationship, right? So there is also early cohabitation with an intimate partner. Um, that was sort of noted that, Grenadian women who entered into their first union at 18 years of age or younger is likely to experience greater prevalence of intimate partner violence. So the younger you are, the more likely to be cohabiting, the more likely you are to experience intimate partner violence, because chances are you are not cohabiting with someone who is close in age to you. You are likely to be cohabiting with someone much older. And that sort of that sort of difference in age does predispose or make it more likely for a woman to experience intimate partner and sexual intimate partner violence, including sexual violence in an intimate relationship. And then, of course, a lot of this has to do with notions of control and power and so on, which I'm happy to get into. So the on the question of how we are doing in the Caribbean, we are not doing very well. Some would argue that maybe in the Caribbean, we persons are more likely to report violence because there might be a greater culture of reporting. But I need to also say that, like other regions of the world, the vast majority of sexual and gender-based violence, or a significant proportion, go unreported. We don't tend to officially report. When it does come into reporting to law enforcement, for example, the response is usually mixed, even though we've had a lot of training of law enforcement officers. Grenada, for example, has a gender-based violence unit within the police
Police
force.
force.
They do, and they're especially trained. But sometimes the challenge we found in the Caribbean, where there are in fact special victims units or gender-based violence units, they tend to be centralized, and a lot of that sensitivity training that needs to happen is not spread out in communities outside where that unit is established. So there needs to be a different kind of training for law enforcement officers in a wide sense. And we also have to remember our law enforcement officers are also members of the very society that holds close these values that reproduce violence in the first place. So we do have to confront some of the very harms that we are trying to eradicate in the spaces that are meant to protect and serve and to prevent these forms of violence. So that is a situation we also have to reckon with in the region.
Okay. Let me ask you. You mentioned age. Any significance of social strata?
So I'm always very careful with how I report, for example, class, as you define it, social strata, because from qualitative research I have personally done, you I've recruited in much older research I've done in St. Vincent and the Grenadines and in Barbados. I've interviewed persons who have come into contact with the state because they are seeking protection. So persons who are less likely to have the economic means to pursue private forms of protection are the ones who come in contact with the state. And it could leave you with an erroneous assumption that gender-based violence is more likely to be experienced or a problem of working class people, because those are the ones who present to the state. But even as the surveys also report that, a lower level of education actually predisposes you to experiencing more sexual and gender-based violence in the context of intimate relationships. Um, it is really important, I think, to consider how we miss a lot of the violence that happens among so-called middle and upper classes because there's a greater degree of secrecy and protection and wanting to protect image and the shame that goes along with reporting violence. Because oftentimes, regardless the class, most people don't report violence because of the shame associated and the kind of victim blaming we end up doing, some of which you see when women are killed, the kind of presumptions we make about women's culpability in the very violence they experience, or young girls' culpability in the very violence they experience, then makes it difficult for persons to want to report. And something as simple as this: we have in some Caribbean countries family courts where the domestic violence acts that we have implemented in various countries across the region are administered. So family courts are meant to hear all issues concerning families except in cases of divorce. If you look at the socioeconomic profile of those who access the services of the family courts, that is not just legal but also psychosocial. So there are counselors at the family court, there are psychologists at family courts, and so you could go to a family court because you want counseling to sort of help you to navigate and end violence in your life, or there's sometimes programs for perpetrators and so on in these family courts. But if you can afford a lawyer and you want to take your matter to the High Court, you can actually do that. And sometimes there's a greater level of secrecy surrounding, because cases involving domestic violence and sexual violence are supposed to be heard in camera, that is in secrecy, whether you're doing it in a family court or in the magistrate's court or in the High Court. But if you're in a country where there are no family courts and your case has to be heard in a magistrate's court because you can't afford a lawyer, can't take it to the High Court, then chances are you are not going to have your case heard in camera, because there are reports from people who frequent magistrates' court of, while they're waiting for their case to be heard, they are listening to a case of domestic violence. And that shouldn't happen, but there are reports of that having happened. I'm not saying it happens in every single case, but it's been reported frequently enough for us to get a sense of how people might be less inclined. And then, because the relationship dynamic often produces situations where it is not necessarily that easy for you to confront or report violence when you are still trying to work out relationship issues and so on and so forth, and that you are more likely to be exposed to further violence and more lethal violence if you report or you try to end a relationship. That often militates against people's decision. And sometimes you're seeing cases involving persons from a more advantageous socioeconomic positioning when it results in the death of a person, right? And that person is oftentimes a woman. So I say all of that to say that, it's really important for us to understand that while the official statistics, that is the actual reporting of sexual and gender-based violence, when you look at the profile of who is making a report and who is likely to be a perpetrator, you are going to see a greater representation of people from disadvantaged socioeconomic positions, right? However, if you only go on official statistics, then you miss the fact that there's a greater degree of secrecy in reporting violence from persons from a more advantageous socioeconomic demographic. And that could often skew our perception of who is viable or who can be violated and who is a violator.
Great. And so you kind of hinted at it earlier, but what are the main drivers of this violence?
So from my own research and from a lot of analyses we see in the region, but in other regions of the world, there are a number of things, particularly when it as it relates to sexual violence, whether it's sexual violence by an intimate partner, someone known to you in a family, or someone not known to you. And most cases of sexual violence, the person violated often knows the perpetrator in the vast majority of cases. In fact, sexual and gender-based violence is most likely to be experienced or perpetrated by someone known to the person victimized, the person harmed, and so on. What we see in terms of both sexual and intimate sexual violence in a non-intimate partner context, as well as intimate partner violence, whether of a sexual or physical nature, and so on, is that men's proprietary attitude towards women is a key organizing feature of this violence. And by that, I mean men's expectation of deference, of ownership, a very high tendency to engage in various acts of objectification of women. So the way in which gender relations are arranged and organized in society tell us a lot about the context within which gender-based violence occurs. And oftentimes we talk about how much progress we have made because we are seeing women in so many spaces in terms of public facing spaces that we haven't seen women in previous decades. And I think sometimes we use that as a singular measure for saying we have equality, we have gender justice, we have gender equality. But a key measure is the fact that we have not dealt with this vexing issue of the very high levels of violence against women. And violence against women and girls is a key indicator of gender systems that do not serve the majority of us remaining intact. It's a key indicator that our gender systems remain uneven, that in gender studies, we say gender relations are relations of power, and you have to understand how that power is organized. So I talked about men's expectation that they should be deferred to, that they should be the main decision makers, and that they should be obeyed, right? So that's one thing. Another key rationalization that I see a lot in my work, and it appears in other work, is men's presumptions of infidelity. Whether those presumptions are true or not, this idea that men are seeking to assert their masculinity, or that they are, they feel violated, emasculated, and violence is a reaction. And what is ironic is that in some of the qualitative work I've done, I've also heard that women report violence when they confront their partners about suspected infidelity on the part of men. And I'm talking here about heterosexual relationships, so I should have issued that caveat from the start, because a lot of the crimes that we just mentioned are of cases involving in the context of heterosexuality. And by that I mean man-woman pairing. Okay. So presumptions of infidelity, you see a lot showing up in this work as well. Expectations of women's domestic responsibility, and that violence is selected as a resort when there are these expectations that women have not acquiesced to their care responsibilities, or haven't done it well, or responsibilities to the household, or how much time women are spending in public spaces. When women make the decision that they would like to end the relationship in the context of intimate partner violence. But with sexual violence, you see showing up quite a bit are these notions not just of a lot of sexual violence, people think it's about sexual desire, but it's more about power than it is about sexual desire. So I'm not saying there's an absence of desire, but if we take that sexual violence and sexual assaults, rape occurs in the context of absence of consent, then it then follows that the person who perpetrates the act has an expectation that they should be able to have access whether you've provided consent or not. So that is about power. And the other thing I'll say is that we do have to spend some time taking it away from the personal, the interpersonal, to the structural arrangements that make it conducive for these violences to happen, these forms of violence to happen. So for example, we might see it in media when we read those comments under the stories when you're reporting this violence. Or things like, oh, women take men's money and then want to leave them. And even though you hear an expression of sympathy for the death or the violence that has occurred, everything that follows the but, everything that follows the but functions as a rationalization or an excuse for that violence. And that is part of the work we have to do to sort of eradicate that violence. You see it showing up in law, for example, in cases of intimate partner violence, where defense attorneys that I have interviewed have shared with me that when it's a case involving intimate partners and they are defending a perpetrator, and all these cases I've looked at are male perpetrators, the vast majority. There are one or two cases of women killing men in the context of intimate relationships in the Caribbean, but they're literally very small. And I'm not saying they're unimportant, but what I want to speak to are the patterns, right? I'm not saying that men have not experienced violence in intimate relationships, but I'm talking about the broader patterns and the overwhelming majority of these cases, which are of the result in the death of women. One of the things that defense attorneys shared with me is that they would immediately make negotiations for the murder charge to be commuted to manslaughter, and they would immediately use the provocation defense, what might be popularly referred to as crimes of passion, as a mitigating circumstance. And I've always found it curious that in these cases there is a kind of a sort of widespread acceptance that in the context of intimate relationship, provocation, whether an excuse about presumed infidelity is used, or the woman has ended the relationship, I could never wrap my mind around how it could be used as a mitigating rather than aggravating circumstance, particularly in cases where the woman has made the decision to end the relationship, is trying to escape the violence and the perpetrator. There is sometimes significant amount of time that has elapsed since the dissolution of the relationship. And there's a pursuit of that person that ends up in her death. So that there's this presumption, because provocation is supposed to technically work in that the violence happens in that moment. But when months and weeks and months have passed and you're still pursuing and you're stalking and you're pursuing that, to be able to use that as a mitigating rather than the prosecution being able to use that as an aggravating circumstance, has always been a curious aspect of the way in which our laws are enacted, that I've found very troubling. And I'm using that example to say that those notions of provocation show up in how people speak and how people excuse their violence. The idea that intimacy makes it difficult for a person to be able to stop themselves from doing violence. We have to probe that. We have to challenge that. And we have to say, no, actually, it doesn't excuse it. It doesn't make it okay. We actually have to find different ways of dealing with a person's choice to end a relationship under any circumstance. Like, no one is duty bound to remain in a union, whether you think it is serving you. If they think it's not serving them, they could walk away under any circumstance and should be allowed to keep their lives, right? And I think there's a way in which a message is being sent from our legal system that circumstances involving intimate partners are more understandable than when it is someone who is what the young people say, someone who's beefing outside and it's man on man violence. That is less seen as with an ability, particularly when there's time in between when a conflict starts and the actual death occurs. So I think we have to reorient our thinking, because it shows up in so many different parts. I've done focus groups with men, I've interviewed men, and the very discourses that they use to explain and excuse their violence seem to align in very troubling ways with how we language these things in law and in our legal decision making.
So how does history and culture fit into to this?
I think in the Caribbean, and I've looked at a lot of gender based violence action plans and policies, there's a way in which I think we oftentimes start with an assumption that gender based violence is so universal that we need not necessarily reflect on its historical antecedents. And that is a dangerous thing because one of the things I say about violence, I too trouble this assumption that Caribbean societies are becoming more violent because we have to remember that violence is at the root of the creation of the Caribbean, at the very root, right? Our societies were formed on the exploitation of indigenous people and attempts at native genocide. It was formed on the mass enslavement of Africans, of West Africans in particular. It was formed on the exploitation of indentured East Indian indentured laborers. And there is a continuation of labor exploitation that we have to probe. And gender based violence is central to the making of the Caribbean in that sense, from the perspective that when it was decided and it was engineered to engage in the mass enslavement of Africans to serve the plantation complex and to enrich Europe, it was done with a very significant exploitation of Afro enslaved women. So we see this in how, for example, Afro enslaved women were expected to reproduce a labor force, particularly in the British Caribbean after 1807 when the slave trade had ended. You actually had this idea that they were ameliorating the conditions under which enslaved African women worked so that they could produce more labor when that had been primarily cut off, or that you had breeding huts, you had breeding houses on plantations, which exploited Black men to function as to sire and father children. And the idea that this was in many cases unwanted by enslaved women, and in some cases by Black men. You had the sexual exploitation of Black men, you had the sexual exploitation of Black women, and then you had these exploitative relationships on plantations where some people would say, oh, some enslaved women entered into these relationships freely. There's no entering into a relationship with an overseer or white planter freely in the context of a plantation complex that was about mass exploitation of people. And whether it is people made decisions to try to ameliorate or mitigate their circumstances, there was never this idea of freely entering into. And I'm not saying that enslaved people were without agency. I'm saying that in a plantation society, agency is significantly compromised, especially when you are categorized as the property under law. So that is the history out of which we are coming, right? And it's the history that produces a very high level of exploitation of girls. You see this, there's a lot of Black feminist literature coming from the US that talks about the adultification of Black and Latino, Black and brown girls in particular. Black and brown girls are sexualized at much earlier rates than any other racialized groups when compared to their white counterparts. In the Caribbean, we have a whole lexicon that sexualizes girls early. There's research coming out, focus groups research coming out of the Eastern Caribbean. That was done over 10 years ago. But you hear these things reproduced. And when you ask people, how are young girls seen in the eyes of older men? I'm not going to repeat some of the language used because I don't want to reproduce that exploitation. But in very many ways, we see some parallels between what is being observed in North America relative to Afro Black American girls and brown American girls and indigenous girls, to what is happening to indigenous brown and Black girls in the Caribbean, where these girls, our girls, are sexualized at much higher rates. That has a history in enslavement, where childhood was looked upon very differently. Women, children, and men arrived in the region from West Africa all as labor. Afro, all as labor. And the sexual and other kind of gender-based exploitation that occurred has its antecedents in that history. If we take the law and how the law is historically, or the legal system we inherited comes out of British common law. And in British common law, it was permissible for a husband to beat his wife, or this idea that you had irrevocably given consent once you become married. Once you're married, that consent has been given for sexual access once you say I do. And that is rooted in British common law. Now, mind you, in many cases, there have been amendments to these laws in the UK. But it's very recently, and in Grenada's case as well, that you have actual marital rape legislation. In some country, the legislation has worked on precedent because there's case law that sort of demonstrates, for example, that rulings that says that a husband can rape his wife. But the idea of consent as being given at marriage and never having to be negotiated once you say I do has its root in English common law. So a lot of what we are assuming is universal and it's everywhere, or these things have just begun in the Caribbean. It is really important for us to think about. Yes, John, that is precisely what I was saying. Both men and women were in fact sexually exploited under the slave comp, in sort of plantation society in the Caribbean. Whether because forcing men to have sex with women to produce children is a form of exploitation, but men were also raped. Men were also raped in the context of plantation society by overseers and by planters, right? And consent is not the idea of someone who is legally enslaved having a consensual relationship. I'm not saying that this never ever happened, but in most circumstances we see patterns of power. The power was racialized and gendered. And so in the Caribbean, when we do gender studies, we often say gender never travels away from race. And that is why we have to think about our history, because race and class in particular, and age, figure prominently in how gender relations unfold in the Caribbean, and they certainly have an impact in how gender systems play out even today.
Okay. Let me ask, you touched on it a while ago, the popular view that the advancement of women professionally and in some cases financially, some people see that as they say that is indicative of improvement and advancement. I want to ask the question a different way. How has that affected, if at all, the power relations that we speak about in intimate relationships?
So I've not done research personally on that particular dimension and how it might be connected to the unfolding of intimate relationships. But what I would say from works that I have read and my own observation is that when you are coming up against a system that, because a lot of the ideologies of gender that we have, the beliefs about gender that we have, come from a value system that was never created to serve us, right? So these ideas we have about family relationships and so on, in many ways, they stem from Victorian ideology. And the thing that people, I think, don't get about Victorian ideology, and by Victorian ideology, I'm talking about that period in the UK history when Queen Victoria was was on the throne. She was, head of state. Um, that in that particular period, there was a lot of pushing values about the nuclear family as the archetypal family type, in which a man is the head, a woman is his should defer to her husband, and then the children defer. So there's that hierarchy set out. And I'm not saying that that didn't precede Queen Victoria, but it was intensified. Why that's important for us to think about in terms of UK society is that that was the arrangement in elite society. And one particular thing, the idea was that men would go and earn, men are the earners, men are breadwinners, women are homemakers. So that was very much so Victorian ideology. But you know what? That was only an elite group of people in the UK who could actually afford for their families to operate like that. Because you had work, that was a period of time when you also had the Industrial Revolution and factory workers, and women worked in factories because they couldn't just rely on a single income in that family to support the family. So even in the UK, this idea that women stayed at home and men went out and worked didn't hold for most of the society. We fast forward and we come to this region. And even though we come out of a situation where women have always worked, because that we arrived as labor, unpaid, exploited, enslaved labor, but we were labor. You move to a post-slavery period in the Caribbean, and all of a sudden, this ideology that men are winners and women ideally shouldn't work, but if they do, their income is always to be read as supplementary, right? Um, takes hold, and I'm saying all of this to say that it really is important for us to understand that we didn't just wake up one day and have these ideas about how families are to be organized. And there's nothing wrong with promoting nuclear families. In fact, in the Caribbean, we have diverse family forms. We have intergenerational families, we have nuclear families, we have a high proportion of households headed by women, in most of those cases, because it could be as a consequence, and a lot of times it is as a consequence of men being not an adult man equal in age, not being in the household. Those households tend to be more financially constrained, though. But that ideology takes hold, and it comes up hard against our material realities. The material realities in the Caribbean is one in which women have always had to work, and families don't function. We don't have, our economies are not organized in such a way to allow for one breadwinner to be in a household. That is just not possible. So that around the time you begin to see those dominant ideologies being challenged and evidence being provided that, listen, this does not work in terms of Caribbean households and economies. But further than that, it is unfair to have a system in which persons are denied access to education, access to employment based on gender. And that was the situation we confronted as countries in the region were independence was coming to different countries in the region. The very limited access to education were for elite children and elite boys mainly. And when elite girls were educated, they were educated in areas like needlework, not so much mathematics, maybe literature. If you look at the girls' schools and the boys' schools who have emerged in the Caribbean in the colonial period and in the immediate aftermath of that formal decolonization process, that we had very limited number of people being able to access education. We also did not Grenada, like the rest of the Caribbean, we weren't given adequate resources to really build out our social structure and our social systems. So a lot of what we see in terms of development in education, in our healthcare and social services, those are things we had to fight for, because the decolonization came without the adequate reparation to build our societies after decades, hundreds of centuries of exploitation. So that is the
What I'm
kind of
getting at,
political
what
economy
I'm trying to
context
get at,
out of which we come in. Sorry?
yeah, I was saying what I'm trying to get at is the fact
Mm-hmm.
that across the higher education institutions in the Caribbean,
Mm-hmm.
I think the figure is about 80% women, 75%, 25% men.
60 something versus 30 something. It's actually two-thirds.
Two
It's more
thirds.
closer to two-thirds. So there's something to be said about that. And
Yeah,
and the thing to be said about that
that's what I wanted
is,
to. Why
right, so
I was trying to
right.
get at.
So I kind of wanted us to understand that education was historically for the elites. Whether those elites were
Yeah,
black and
I
brown
understand that,
and
but I'm
white
speaking
elites,
now.
right? But remember, I'm saying this to say that access to education that we talk about is still a very elite access to education. So the vast majority of our men and women are not accessing higher education in any large numbers. In fact, in the Caribbean, we are the region with the lowest number of our school leaving youth actually accessing tertiary level training, post-secondary training, and university education. We have the lowest numbers in the different regions of the world. So let's start there. When we go now and look at what is happening in education, so access to university opens up in terms of more women being able to access university from about the early 80s. But again, that is an elite number because it's not like free education everywhere in the Caribbean. You still have to find means through which to fund that education. And even though as we have opened up access, it's still not open enough, right? What we are seeing is that as access opened up, girls and young women, older women, women from different age demographics are taking advantage of those opportunities. And we are having to do far more work to recruit men. And when we kind of drill down a little bit further, we are recognizing, hang on, men are more likely to want to enter the labor force earlier because of this male as breadwinner ideology and how dominant it is, that they are not seeing the 3 to 5 years that you might need to spend, or how a lot of women are actually accessing university is that they're working full time and they're doing university part time and they're taking 5, 6, 7, 8 years to complete their degrees, but they're completing those degrees. And we are not seeing young men willing to do that. We are also seeing young men circumventing tertiary education because it doesn't align with their vision of themselves as young men. And that is a
Yeah, so
reality for which.
my question really was, given the central
Mhm,
role and the central place of power
mhm,
in terms of what we speak on, yeah,
mhm.
my question really was, in what way has this shift, I don't know if I would call it, if you would call it a shift, but this this situation in which you have more women taking advantage of these opportunities than young men, how has that impacted on what we speak about tonight? So, for example, is it that men are responding physically because they're still stronger?
I would, it's very, I am very careful about, t- going on a hunch or
Right.
taking a go at it. And because
As a researcher, I understand.
anecdotally, you're hearing some reports of, oh, um, you know, young women are educating themselves at faster rates than our young men, and this is having an impact. But I think we have to be very careful not to reproduce a commonsensical way of framing this in the absence of actually drilling down. So, for example, there's that strong perception that that happens, but we are not sure in terms of numbers,
Right.
frequency, what happens to a relationship when one member of the relationship happen, and it's more, as you say, more likely to be a woman because of how many women are being educated relative to men. What happens to a relationship when one person professionally upgrades and now has a university degree, and the other person has not made an equivalent upgrade? What happens when there's a misalignment between how much education or training or growth that happens from doing a
And
degree? And I think
consequently,
this
the
is the other
financial
thing.
resources that they can cover.
And not oh, no, but the growth that happens when you do a degree. I think why I'm being very careful here is because of one of the main rationalization that I have seen for why these violent acts happen is that, oh, now she could support herself, she doesn't need him. And if that, even if that were true, is that, does that justify violence? Let's
No.
say,
So
let's
so that's we have to address that.
precisely. So I'm saying we have to
Yes.
work with, we have to work. I almost feel like if we have to take a step back from when the actual violence occurs and look at these antecedents and probe them and confront them. And we are not, because I think we are in this constant mode of trying to figure out why once a woman has been killed, once a child loses her life.
Indeed, yes. That
And
was
I
last
think we
week.
have to do the work
Editorial.
we have to do the work on the other end. And this is where,
Yeah.
for me, some of the work I'm seeing coming out of the region, some of the work we are involved in at the Institute for Gender and Development Studies, is working at the younger age level, working with young people in secondary schools to get them to understand these uneven relationships. But when you do the work at the level of education, what is often missing is an equal level of accountability work that has to happen more broadly at the level of the state, whether it's through our laws, with the kind of programming we have, the kind of messaging we have about gender and gender-based violence. And I think a lot of what the work we have to do is actually talking about gender systems, how they show up, how they are not serving the majority of us, including men and women. Our gender systems do not serve the majority of us, but we encourage to keep them intact because it serves an elite few people, an elite group of people. If we were to look at our political economy in the Caribbean and how resources are distributed and allocated and accessed, we would be less likely to want to hold on to these very harmful assumptions that do not serve us. And I think we are holding on to them under some assumption that it's culture, or that you're going to lose something if you were to let go of this need to control, right? I think we have to ask ourselves those hard questions. A very, very important program that Grenada has that I would really love to spotlight here. I would like to shout out Tyrone Buckmeyer and the team at Legal Aid and Counseling Clinic. For over a decade, for more than 15 years, sorry, a decade and a half, they have been running two programs: a perpetrator prevention program, the Partners for Peace program, and they've been running support groups for women as part of the range of services that Legal Aid and Counseling Clinic provides. They often work with court men who have been referred to from the courts for engaging in acts of intimate partner violence against their partners. And they have to be part of almost 1 year program. And out of that program, one of the things that Tyrone Buckmeyer has talked about in various fora is how, for example, it takes them that long to actually move men from a place of, yes, I committed an act of violence, but it was my fault. It was the situation, it was the woman, it was everyone else. To seeing them come to a place of owning and taking responsibility. Now, but I would say that they either take that program or they face jail time. So they opt to take the program. And he would tell you they come kicking and screaming to begin with. And they spend that first few weeks sort of, externalizing the responsibility. But by the end of that program, and I mention them because perpetrator prevention programs do not have a very good response rate or success rate globally. But this one in Grenada is a kind of outlier in that it gets Ben at least to the place of responsibility. But they would tell you that much more work still needs to be done because
It's hard work. It's hard
responsibility is the
work.
beginning. They don't necessarily get to a place where they see women as equal partners or get to a place where they necessarily are willing to release those harmful assumptions about gender that produces inequality and by extension produces violence, right? So I wanted to spotlight that program because programs like that are important when they work, right? But what that program is also doing is providing important education that you would not ordinarily get in your everyday. And more programs like that need to be replicated in communities because and in platforms and in spaces and in ways and in modalities that could reach people. We have to, I mean, this is a whole of society problem. Our responses have to be multiple. Grenada has a gender-based violence action plan that it's getting ready to. There was one before, and the timeline from that has run out. But you now have a 2026 to I think 2030 or 2031 gender-based violence action plan, which envisions a set of actions and mechanisms to help to reduce violence. Some of the challenges we have with action plans is that they need to be more fully resourced and they need to be reaching people from so many different spaces. Like we actually need our community leaders, our religious leaders, our leaders in education, our youth leaders, our civil society, our community-based organizations, our NGOs, our private sector. We need everybody on board, and we need people to be in unison. That are all carrying messages that we won't accept these ways of being. Like we don't have to be this way. We can make the decision to change our violent inheritance, and releasing our violence
Okay.
inheritance means that we do not perpetuate a colonial mindset that is inherently violent.
Yes. Would you agree with me that while gender-based violence is based on the data, it's quite pervasive. We tend to focus mainly on the extreme cases, like the killings, or we tend to just focus on that, and the emphasis whenever you have these situations occurring is that punishment, 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 punishment. Yeah. But based on what I hear you saying tonight is that what became the death last week or week before or last year or year before, it started off maybe with a much smaller act of violence that required a much earlier intervention. You'll agree with me on that, right?
Absolutely. And we focus on the extreme cases because there is real pain for a community to have to live with the death of one of its children. And by children,
Understood.
I'm using children to mean anyone from a community, regardless of
Yeah.
age. When you
Yes.
deal with the unconscionable and unprovoked
Mhm.
death of someone, the community is in pain. And I would much prefer these women to have their lives. And I'm sure every member of the community would much prefer these women to have their lives
Mhm.
than to have to confront the ramifications. But you're also absolutely right. What we see that ends in death has a buildup. Sexual and gendered violence occur in patterns, particularly when it's interpersonal, when it's between people who know each other. There is a buildup. When a child is sexually violated, somebody doesn't appear one day and just sexually violate that child. There is a whole process of sort of having that child get to a place of comfort where they build up some level of trust, or it's opportunistic. But there are patterns, and sometimes the abuse happens for years. In the context of intimate partner violence, for incarcerated men that I have interviewed, most of them would say to me they weren't violent throughout the relationship. They would say to me in some fact, some of them said to me the first time any violence occurred was that which resulted in the death of their former partners. And they would say this to me even though they know that I have access to seeing their case files, because that is something for which I had to get permission. But in that interview, they were very invested in presenting themselves as nonviolent. But when I read the case files, in several cases, there were several reports made to law enforcement. There were witnesses who spoke to patterns of violence having occurred throughout the course of the relationship. And in fact, when I speak to some women, they would say to me that behaviors that they read as love to begin with, they then realize deep into the relationship
Control.
it wasn't. So following, they would say like, "Oh, I thought he was just really into me," and then I realized no, that was the early signs of me being controlled in this relationship. So you're right that there are these patterns that emerge, or that someone engages in a violent act, apologizes for the violent act, gives gifts, start what young people would call all the love bombing. And then that cycle is repeated. You get comfortable again, and then you experience violence. And then there's an apology, and then there are gifts, and there's a trying to get you back. But what I think a lot of people don't realize, because in doing this work, I've been confronted with the question, so why would a woman stay in a violent relationship? It is very difficult to leave a violent relationship because you are at greatest risk when you make that decision to leave. When you have left, you are at greatest risk. And sometimes, because of the shame associated with leaving and admitting that this relationship didn't work, this was a violent relationship, or maybe family members might not have endorsed the relationship in the first place. Sometimes, many women trying to leave those circumstances do not feel empowered or safe, or they have a network to leave. And even when they have networks, there are cases of women killed who not only did they leave the relationship, they left their homes that they were paying to stay in, returned to their family members so that they could have greater protection, and they were still killed. There
I guess
were
that's,
women who
yeah.
were turned away from police stations, who they call the police didn't turn up. There's the famous Todd Lampkins case from Trinidad and Tobago, where reports after reports were made, and the last report that was made, the district police station said that they didn't have a vehicle to come to the home. And the following day, that woman was killed, right? And I guess I am underscoring the death of women, because not to say that the buildup isn't there and there aren't patterns that lead on to these deaths. But I want us to remember these deaths, because if this cannot stir us into an urgency, I don't know what else would.
Okay. Well, I just want to. I think you're seeing John there. John has been very active. That's Gem
Mhm.
FM, and you are seeing him there. Uh, but I just want to. We have very few comments tonight. I guess people probably are mostly gripped by your presentation. But um, Cyrus was asking, what do you think causes or leads to such brutal actions against women? I think he went into that in terms of the it's a matter of power, a matter of control, and Ricardo was saying equal amount of young men are doing it these days, and sometimes with significant older women, especially foreign based.
So
I
that
think
I missed that. I know I'm not seeing all the comments, so could you repeat that? I missed.
equal amount of women are doing it these days, and sometimes with significantly older, sorry, equal amount of young men are doing it these days, and sometimes with significantly older women, especially foreign these. I think you were talking about the age difference between young women, older men. So
So
this person is
and not just these days, he's actually right in terms of research that comes out of the Caribbean that shows how, particularly with our tourism-based economies, there are a number of these relationships between younger men and older women tourists, um, as a means through which to generate income or to seek opportunities to migrate and so on. There's research coming out of Jamaica, out of Barbados, and particularly in a context where, for some of those young men, they would engage in sex tourism, but they also have families in their communities that they maintain a relationship with, and women in communities, women and children, that they may have children with women. And there was a sort of, I would say, somewhat of a crisis in the early years of the HIV epidemic in the Caribbean, in the 90s in particular, where women in those relationships with these men who were engaged in sex tourism were trying to negotiate condom use because they were very aware that they were trying to earn money through the tourism industry, and sometimes found it difficult. And then they saw a rise in sexually transmitted infection as a consequence of sort of those tourist economies. So, what's the person's name again who made that comment?
Ricardo. Ricardo.
Ricardo. So
Ricardo explains.
Ricardo is right in talking about how, for example, but it how, for example, those relationships unfold, and it's particularly noticeable and observable. And there's research on this by persons like Kamala Kempadu, who has in which they've demonstrated. Mark Padilla for the Dominican Republic, Kamala Kempadu does research, I think, had done research in Barbados, um, and I can't remember the name of the researchers who did work in Jamaica as well. But what it shows is that that is very much connected to the economic opportunities available in Caribbean political economies. And you will see these kinds of arrangements, particularly in tourist-based economies, where those kinds of relationships are pursued.
Yes. Okay, so this was very informative. I just want to recognize those sponsoring the program. Once again, Gen Professional Solutions Inc., Gem FM carrying the program on FM radio out of Canada, and also Grenada Technical and Allied Workers Union. One person here, John says both men and women.
So I am seeing I'm seeing, let me just try to
Tonight
try.
about 3,000. I'm not sure what it's about, if it's because of the weather
Right.
or what it's
So,
in
no,
Canada.
no, no. I think John is reading from like global statistics, or maybe statistics from Canada, the frequency with which women are killed. Um, it is, unfortunately, when it comes to intimate partner homicide, the research is more stark in terms of the gender distribution of who is a perpetrator and who is likely to be victimized. It is probably space in which you see the widest gap, where an overwhelming majority of persons killed in the context of intimate partner homicide are women in heterosexual relationships. So I'm not sure if John's comment is to point to the gravity of those cases. And I'm not saying all cases of gender-based violence are in fact intimate partner homicide, because the harrowing case in Grenada recently was a case of a non-partner who attacked an undeserving young woman, and nobody should be attacked. It doesn't matter, young, old, it doesn't matter. Nobody should be attacked like that. But women die at an alarming rate globally. And in the Caribbean, given the size of our populations, we have too many women dying. One is too many. One person dying in the context of gender-based violence is too many. But the frequency with which women and children are exposed is really alarming for us in the region. And we really do,
Yes.
during the COVID-19 pandemic, I did some research, and Dr. Wendy Grenade, who I think um, we both know, we worked on an edited collection of double volume for Palgrave called herself, Shoma Roberts was the lead editor, doing definition myself, called Interdisciplinary Perspectives on COVID-19 and the Caribbean. And the research I was doing then was looking at the ways in which, as we were kind of focused on engaging in a number of mitigation measures to address COVID as we needed to, because this was a global pandemic and a crisis, a serious health crisis. We didn't spend enough time thinking about how we tailor prevention and response services to address gender-based violence, especially because those of us who are working in this space know in times of crises, gender-based violence escalates. So severe in the context of things like explosive volcanic eruptions, hurricanes, and the displacement that comes with that. We see an escalation of violence, and COVID-19 was no different. And some people began to refer to it as a shadow pandemic. And I was not very comfortable with that term, because the pandemic of the levels of violence against women had been astronomical. Like, more women were killed during the COVID-19 pandemic by gender-based violence than they were killed by COVID. And that is a global reality. More women were killed as a consequence of gender-based violence
In the Caribbean also?
than COVID. And I say that to say, we do not recognize with the severity and urgency we need to what we are really talking about when we talk about gender-based violence as being a major crisis. And it has been a crisis that predated COVID or any other hurricane. It escalates. Economic crisis, violence escalates. During holidays, violence escalates. In places like the UK, you see an increase in violence against women on days when there are major premiership matches. Why? Men are outside drinking and then they return to their homes. So when we say epidemic levels, we are not being alarmist. We are talking facts.
Okay, before we end and before I invite you to give closing comments, someone has asked me to ask you, in the context of something you mentioned earlier, maybe the underreported higher strata levels in our societies, to ask if there's any possibility of the Epstein kind of process taking place any place in the Caribbean.
So I would say this. There
And
is
by that, you're speaking about this, all the drama taking place now with the Epstein files. And I think what he's focusing on, if there's that level of exploitation by people who have money, wealth, power, exploited young girls, and so if there's any,
that kind of network of trafficking. So I
yes,
would say this. How trafficking shows up in the Caribbean, and we have to be careful to not conflate trafficking with sex work, where people are actually making decisions to move from country to country, whether they're moving from one Caribbean country to another or coming from South America, Central America to the Caribbean. In some of those instances, people are coming on their own volition and exploitation may happen. Where we see examples of what is defined as trafficking in the Caribbean are, for example, when people move for work that they think has nothing to do with sex work. They might move for domestic work and a job opportunity may be advertised. And as soon as they arrive on the shores, their passports are withheld and they're forced into sex work and a situation of sexual exploitation that is in fact sexual violence. I know of no case with that very highly sophisticated network that has come to be known as contained in the Epstein file, and the fact that we know that these things actually happened. We have enough evidence, we have enough witness statements. There is enough to tell us that that was a whole network that was protected by very powerful people for a very long time. I am not aware of anything of that proportion in the Caribbean, but what I can say is that there's actual research that shows that some form of sexual exploitation that amounts to trafficking happens in the Caribbean, whether the Caribbean is a transshipment point or those cases of people withholding the passport of others, or in some of the larger countries in the Caribbean where persons are lured into coming to spaces in the city from rural areas for work and they end up being sexually exploited, right? But I can't say that I know it is on that kind of highly networked level. And we see in countries that are larger, these networks can actually exist. The Epstein example is probably one of the most prominent, but there are other examples in other parts of Europe, in Scandinavian countries, some of those very countries that are often constructed as scoring very high in the gender equality index, the global gender equality index, as having some of the most progressive policies, of having some of the most gender fair policies, have some of the worst cases of trafficking in women, right? So it tells us something about how much legislating at the level of the state is extremely important and policy at the level of the state is extremely important, but it's far from being enough, right? But I am not personally aware, I would say, of
Yes, okay.
at that level. Yeah.
Okay, Doc, thank you so much. I will give you the last one still, but I just want to say that two things that I'm left with. One, that the situation is serious, it's crisis level. We have an epidemic in terms of gender-based violence. And two, we can't just wait for when someone gets killed. It needs to be all hands on board, an integrated process, integrated arrangement with the communities, the schools, the community organizations, the education system, and of course the state. So I now give you the last word before we close, and I really want to thank you tonight for coming. Thank all those who viewed the program, but I want to give you the last word.
I think I would say thank you as well for inviting me into the space. Grenada is dear to my heart. It's the first place I ever traveled outside of St. Vincent and the Grenadines. And it's the place I probably enjoy going the most in the Caribbean. It reminds me a lot of home. And so I think we deserve better for our women, for our children, for all our people. I would encourage Grenadians to really do a deeper dive into what your state has promised you. Your state has created a national sustainability plan which embeds gender, which embeds a very strong gender analysis. Your state has created a gender equality plan. Your state has 2 cycles of a gender-based violence action plan. You're getting to finalize the second cycle of a gender-based violence action plan. Your state is a signatory of the Committee for the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. And you are also signatory to the Bellum de Para Convention on Ending Violence Against Women. So in terms of the normative framework in Grenada that the state has provided is very strong. Your state also got funding to strengthen its state response to gender-based violence. So I would encourage persons to familiarize themselves, but I would also say have a national conversation and have smaller conversations in your various communities. And whether that community is a village or a support, a group of people who get together because they're like-minded, have the conversation and demand more of yourselves. Because I think if we are really serious about ending our colonial inheritance of violence, we must see ending violence against women and girls and gendered violence more broadly as part of that work. And, just know that you have people across the region in solidarity with you, because we are all going through it and we want to see a close and end to violence against women. And I just saw my country compadre make a comment, Jomo Thomas. So let me just give a quick shout out to Jomo, someone who has been in the struggle to sort of have these questions, ask these hard questions of ourselves, So I'll just say a pleasant night to Grenada. Thank you very much for having me. And just know that I and my community here at the Institute for Gender and Development Studies at the UWI stand with Grenada.
Thank you so much. Good night to everyone. Till
Good
next week.
night.
Goodbye.